Hello to everyone. Thank you for being here today for part 2 of our 3-chapter look at the Civil War. In today's talk, we're going to cover the 5, what I consider, at any rate, to be the 5 biggest myths of the Civil War. But before we get to that, I just want to tell you just a little bit about myself. My name is Americo Tulipano. I think it's listed as Rick Tulipano in the guide that you have here. I am the 12th of 12 children. I am the last in a big immigrant Italian family. My folks were farmers. They grew up in Mussolini's Italy. My dad was a soldier in the fascist army. He was drafted. My dad was illiterate, but they drafted him anyway, and they sent him off to Africa. During the war, Americans came to it. The Germans came first to occupy Italy. Then the Americans came, and American soldiers, my parents always said, the Americans brought food, they brought medicine, and they brought freedom to Italy. And they always thought, these guys, wherever these guys come from, we've got to go there. We've got to move our family. So it took years, but by 1954, they made it to America. And I was born the year after they arrived in 53. I was born in 54. And my folks never fell out of love with America. I had a college friend who was over for dinner one time, and he was very kind of radical. And he said, America is a fascist country. And my dad said, gay isa tito, what did he say? And so I explained it to him. And my father almost had a fit. He said, you have no idea what a fascist country is. You don't know until you live in one. He read my friend The Riot Act. My poor friend was like, no college professor had ever talked to him like that. Anyway, my parents' love for America led to me having a love for history. I love everything about American history. There are episodes that aren't very pleasant, but I just cherish the study of history. So I became a history teacher. I have a master's degree in history. My first job was teaching at North Quincy High School a lifetime ago. And then I got a job teaching for the state of Massachusetts. But they had me teaching things about state regulations and going around to various state groups and teaching them about the whys and the wherefores of state employment. I wasn't crazy about that, but it paid the bills, and I did it for 30 years. But I finally did get back to teaching history, which is what I do now and what I absolutely love to do. And so, with that, I'm going to get right in to our part 2 of our series. What are the 5 biggest myths of the Civil War, according to this observer? Well, before we get into that, let's just kind of refresh our minds, some of the basics about the Civil War. It lasted from April 1861 until April 1865, almost exactly 4 years, 48 months, almost, not quite, but almost to the day. And in that 48-month period, it is estimated today, and this is something I think we mentioned in our last talk, today it is estimated that well over 700,000 Americans died as a direct result of the Civil War. Now, in some earlier books, you see this a lot in old school textbooks and things of that sort. You see that number 620,000. It consistently appears in the literature. But over the past 2 or 3 decades, some very good historical researchers have delved into this subject, and they have determined that the death toll was almost certainly over 700,000. It ranges from 700 all the way up to 770,000 dead as a result of the Civil War. And so that means that the Civil War was deadlier than all of these other American wars combined. Death gets, what was it? Joseph Stalin said, one death is a tragedy, a million death is a statistic. And he would know about millions of deaths. But he's on to something. Death tolls can rise to such a point that it becomes just, an abstraction. It loses that feeling of tragedy, and it just becomes a numbers game. And I don't mean to reduce any death toll in Civil War or any other tragedy to just a numbers game. But the numbers, even in an abstract sense, are just staggering. When I was a teenager, the Vietnam War was going on, and I remember Life magazine, some of you may remember this, Life magazine at the height of the war, the worst week of the war, Life magazine published a photo of every American killed in Vietnam over a period of this one exceptionally deadly week. I think it was over 200 Americans killed in that 1 week. And they had a photo, the name, where they were born, where they grew up. And it really brought it home. It made it very powerful, heartbreaking. Well, in the Civil War, that was a tragic week in Vietnam, 200 Americans killed. In the Civil War, if we were to average out the numbers of people who died because of the war on a day-to-day basis, that number would be over 500 people, not every week, every single day, for 4 straight years, for 48 straight months. And then you would have to add the number of people who were crippled for life because of the injuries sustained during the war. That would be another 100 people, over 100 people a day, every single day for 48 straight months. So any way you cut it, the losses in this war are almost unfathomable, incomprehensible. It was one hell of a price tag to pay to win this war, to hold the country together, and ultimately to abolish slavery. You can't put a price tag on, just for the North now, not including the South. The Southerners were fighting for slavery, but just for the Northern forces, well over 400,000 men killed or crippled for life. Said, let's get down to our myths. We're going to go over the 5 top myths in my humble estimation. Myth number 1, slavery was not the main cause of the Civil War. The issue of states' rights and low tariffs were just as important to the South as slavery. You see this on the internet. You see it. There are some books that have been written about it. This is one of, this book by Seabrook was a bestseller, especially in the South. Everything you were taught about the Civil War is wrong. And he really makes this case that it was a states' rights, low tariffs issue. And that's what really propelled the Civil War. Slavery was important, but not that important. Well, it's a claim that's just demonstrably false. I use the word demonstrably in a qualified way, provided that one is willing to look at the historical evidence. Then it becomes a demonstrably false claim. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican candidate for president, as we all know, in 1860. He was a moderate. He wasn't a fire eater, as they called abolitionists. There were fire eaters in the Republican Party. William Seward wanted to abolish slavery immediately. And he was much better known than Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And Seward certainly, if he had been the Republican candidate for president, he certainly would have won some northern states. But there's no way he would have carried the nation So, and that's why the Republican managers settled on Lincoln, because he had a more moderate stance towards slavery. He assured Southern leaders, because they were saying, if this guy is elected, we're out of here. We're leaving the United States of America. We are seceding from the Union if that man gets elected. Well, Lincoln said, look, everything's on the table. You want to talk about tariffs? I'll talk about tariffs. We can negotiate. We can find common ground. You want to talk about states' rights? We can talk about that. We can work it out. We can negotiate. There's no reason for us to fall apart over this. But he said one thing that they couldn't cotton to, excuse the word, probably not the best chosen word. Lincoln said, he made it clear, that he would not allow slavery to spread out to the new Western territories. These territories in 1860 were beginning to be organized to create states, and Southern leaders wanted this southern swath, everything from Missouri all the way to California. They wanted this preserved for slavery. They wanted slavery to spread. Lincoln said no. He said, in America, we've compromised too much. We compromised in the Constitution. We've compromised over the Missouri Compromise and a number of other compromises. We're done compromising. Now, he assured them. He said, I'm not going to do anything about slavery where it exists. I'm not going to touch it. You have it for as long as you want it, but it's not going to spread. That's what infuriated Southern leaders. Had nothing to do with states' rights, had nothing to do with tariffs. He was perfectly willing to discuss those things, but he wouldn't discuss the spread of slavery. Others, the outgoing President Buchanan, tried to talk him into it. Crittenden, the senator from Kentucky, offered the Crittenden Compromise, and Lincoln said no to all of it. He said, no more compromising on the spread of slavery. So that's why they were so furious at him. A few years before things came to blows in America, there was not a senator, he was a congressman from South Carolina. His name was Preston Brooks. He was an upstanding man of the South, gentleman of the South, as they say. And he heard a Northerner, this fellow, Senator Charles Sumner from our very own state, he gave a speech a few days earlier. And it really riled up Preston Brooks. Preston Brooks was in a lather, and he just couldn't bear it anymore. So he walked over, he had a cane, he had a very solid wooden cane, and he walked over to Preston Brooks's desk. And Brooks was writing something on his desk, and I'm sorry, Sumner was writing something on his desk. And Brooks walked over and he whacked him with the cane right over the head. And then he did it again. And then he did it again. And then he did it almost 30 times. Charles Sumner was a bloody mess. He was on the floor fighting for his life. Didn't stop until the cane shattered. And it was a sturdy cane, but it finally broke. He hit him so hard so many times, the cane gave way. Now, what could have incited such a homicidal outburst? It turns out that Charles Sumner had given a speech in the Senate a few days earlier. What could he have said? Did he say something about Preston Brooks's mother? No, he didn't. Did he say something about tariffs? No, nothing. Did he say something about states' rights? Not a thing. He said slavery was a brutally immoral institution. That was it. That's when Preston Brooks saw red and said, I'm going to make that man pay. And many other Southern congressmen and senators were all for it. During the beating, this man, several senators and congressmen ran to the scene. They were going to pull Preston Brooks off. They wanted to break up this melee. And this man, Senator Henry Edmondson, I believe He's from Mississippi. Don't hold me to that. I think he's from Mississippi. He's a Southern senator, I know that. And he walked over and reached into his vest, and he pulled out a gun. And he said, "Do not interfere." He's looking at the other senators, and he said, "Don't interfere." And he brandished his gun. And so Brooks was allowed to continue his attack, complete his attack. What incited this rage was slavery, pure and simple. Nothing else could have worked someone like Brooks into such a lather. Now, you might wonder, what happened to Brooks after this? I mean, he was a gentleman of the South. He was reared to observe a certain code of behavior, right? And you would think that maybe some Southern leaders, some kind of advice givers on etiquette maybe, would have said, you know, "Mr. Brooks, you went just a little bit too far. That's not the gentlemanly thing to do. You know, maybe you should have handled it a little differently." No, nothing like that happened. Preston Brooks went back to his home state of South Carolina, and they practically carried him off the train. People gave him canes as gifts. Newspapers they sang his praises in their columns. There was a huge meeting in Charleston, and thousands of people turned out to praise him, to show him their appreciation. They weren't embarrassed. They weren't ashamed at the barbarity of this act. They were all for it. If Charles Sumner came close to dying, it took him months to recuperate. If he had died, it wouldn't have made one whit of difference to these people. And the thing that got them so fired up was this idea that slavery was absolutely immoral. That it was nothing got them angrier than when they said slavery was ungodly, that it was a sin against God, a sin against ultimate justice. That infuriated them. They wanted to strangle people who said such a thing. And this was the case in this horrific beating. Another point of proof we can pull out here. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. The people of Kansas were going to be allowed to decide whether or not slavery would be legal in their state. It was going to be put to a vote. That's democracy, right? That's states' rights, right? So nothing wrong with states' rights in Kansas, right? And there's a farmer working in his field. He's an anti-slavery farmer. He's very pro-free labor. And he has talked about this publicly. People know where he stands. A group of men ride up to him one day and they say, "Are you so-and-so?" And he says, "Yeah." And they pull out their guns and they shoot him dead. And this is the first fatality in what would become known as Bleeding Kansas. Pretty soon, there was fighting going on both sides, and it got really nasty. Dozens of people would be killed, into the hundreds would be wounded. Most of the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was a pro-slavery, it was an anti-slavery town. It was basically it was a large village that consisted of anti-slavery farm families. Well, most of it was burned down by a pro-slavery mob. And now this is just a preview of what was coming in the Civil War. This was just a microcosm of that war. But again, states' rights could never have incited this kind of homicidal rage. Kansas had states' rights. Tariffs weren't even an issue in Kansas. No one even bothered with it. It was all about slavery. That was the only thing that could have made these human beings do this to each other. Another point of proof along these lines. The 11 states that seceded from the Union all had In terms of their state populations, they had the highest percentage of slaves of any state. There were 4 other states that allowed slavery: Missouri, Kentucky. West Virginia was not a state. It didn't become a state until 1863. But Maryland and Delaware, 4 border states. But the percentage of slaves in their states, the ratio of slaves to free people, was very low. Whereas in these 11 red states, it was very high. And these are the states that seceded. These others did not secede. That a coincidence? Of course not. You could almost work out a simple mathematical formula to determine which states would be most likely to secede. And it carries right through. It explains this, the states that seceded and the ones that didn't. Another point of proof, the Confederate Constitution. After the Confederate States withdrew from the Union, they got together in Alabama to, their first capital was in Alabama. They eventually moved it to Richmond. But while they were in Alabama, they wrote out a Confederate Constitution, very similar to the U.S. Constitution. But there were a few glaring differences. And one of the biggest was this line: "No law impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed." The Confederate Constitution went on to say that the Confederate law is supreme. Supreme over what? Supreme over the states. In other words, if there's a disagreement between the states and the Confederate government wins. No contest. So what does that tell you about states' rights in the South? How important could they have been? They would have enshrined states' rights in their Constitution. They would have said the states have just as much power as the Confederate government does. But they didn't say that. They said just the opposite. So that's another indication that it was about slavery. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy in the early stages of the war, gave a rousing speech in Savannah, Georgia. And he told a throng, thousands and thousands of his fellow citizens, that our new Constitution has put to rest forever all the questions relating to African slavery. This is the immediate cause of the present revolution. No one could say it. How could you say it more clearly than that? He is laying it right out. And this is the vice president of the Confederacy. Many, many, many state leaders echoed those comments. And if we had enough time, I would just, list them one after another after another. They show beyond any shadow of a doubt that it was all about slavery. Now, am I saying that there was no friction over tariffs? No, I'm not saying that. There were arguments. There were debates. But that's precisely my point. They were debates. And sometimes they got hot under the collar. Sometimes they shook their fist at each other. But they didn't kill each other. That's the key line, that's crossed when a debate turns into homicide. You've crossed the line. And the same applies to states' rights. Of course there were differences. Of course there were disagreements. But none of them ever caused anyone to murder someone else. Only slavery could do that. Another myth, second myth about the Civil War. Southern leaders tried hard to avoid the Civil War. In my travels to the South, I often talk to, Southern people. Very nice, but wonderful, kind people, and I haven't got anything bad to say, except one thing. A number of them have said to me, we wanted to avoid the war. Our ancestors wanted to avoid the war. We didn't want to fight. We wanted just to go our own way. We wanted peace. But you Northerners, you wouldn't let us have peace. So we had to fight. Well, history tells a very different story. Abraham Lincoln, he is elected to the presidency right away. Very shortly after, South Carolina secedes, and then the other 10 southern states secede, the ones with the most slaves. Lincoln gets up, his first inaugural address, and he pleads with southern leaders. If you read, it's heartrending when you read that speech. He says, we must be friends. We are friends, all the patriot graves that we both honor, that we both share, so forth and so on. And then he says something so clear in the middle of his inaugural address. And now he's talking to America, but he's specifically talking to Southern leaders. He says, the government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. He's telling Southern leaders, there will be no war, there will be no bloodshed unless you shed it, unless you start this thing going. He couldn't be any clearer on that point. And he's on record now with the whole of the United States of America. It wouldn't be easy for him to contradict himself on this point. Well, Southern leaders heard him say it. These are some of the foremost Southern leaders in 1860. They heard him say those words. Now, they could have said, okay, we'll take him at his word. We won't attack any federal facility or any federal personnel. We'll leave them alone, and we'll have peace, and we'll go our own way. Fair enough. But that's not what happened. In the middle of Charleston Harbor, some of you may have been there, there's that dot there in the middle of the map is Fort Sumter. If you haven't been there, if you ever go there, you'll be astonished at how small it is. I went there thinking it was going to be like a castle in the ocean, looking up for this tremendous fortress. It's on 2.5 acres of land, depending on the tide. And it's a relatively small fort. Maybe I expected too much, But this fort in 1861 housed about 4 dozen U.S. soldiers. That was it. They had muskets. They posed no threat to the Confederacy. There was nothing those 4 dozen soldiers were going to do to bring down the Confederacy. They posed no threat at all. But they were running out of food and water. So the commander of the fort, a guy named Major Robert Anderson, sent messages to Washington saying, we're running low, and we're going to need to abandon the fort, but we're running low on food and water. He had sent earlier messages too, and Buchanan sent some supply. James Buchanan was president at that time, before Lincoln took office, and he sent some Navy supply ships. Confederate artillery opened fire on U.S. Navy supply ships, and it forced the ships to sail back to Washington. So now Anderson was reiterating, we're very low. We're almost out of food and water. So Abraham Lincoln arranged for some Navy cargo vessels, not warships, cargo vessels, to supply food and water, to sail down to Fort Sumter. But he also sent messages to the governor of South Carolina and other Confederate officials saying, making it clear, these are cargo vessels, they contain water, and they contain food. That's it. There's no ammunition, there's no extra troops, there's no cannons, there's nothing like that. Water and food, and that's it. So please, let them pass. But if you open fire, then the responsibility for this war will be on your shoulders. Do not open fire. Now, you would think that if the Confederate leaders, Jefferson Davis, and this is him in his cabinet, actually, Robert E. Lee was not in his cabinet. They threw him in because he was a Confederate hero and they wanted him to be in the picture. But you would think Confederate leaders would have said, let's leave Sumter alone. We want peace, right? We want peace. We don't want to start a war. So let's leave the fort alone. If Lincoln does something aggressive, if those troops come out and they try to land on Southern soil, or they start shooting cannon or whatever, then boy, we'll give them what for. But otherwise, leave well enough alone. Very reasonable stance, right? Very logical. Well, Southern pride took that position and flung it right out the window. They didn't want to hear about reason and logic. They were furious that the North would dare to have this one little fort in Charleston Harbor. And so on the morning of April 12th, 1861, Jefferson Davis himself gives the order for Confederate cannon to open fire on Sumter. And that's what happens. I think it's like over 3,000 cannons have been arranged around the fort by that time. And they all open fire, and they blast away for 36 hours. And finally, Anderson surrenders. He runs up a white flag. And this is how it starts. The South could have avoided this so easily. And they don't like to be reminded of that today. When I mention that to my Southern friends, they kind of, they have nothing they can say, so they end the argument. And they say, oh, you're just going to believe whatever you want to believe. But this is what started it. Lincoln sent out a call for 75,000. Initially, it was just 75,000 volunteers to put down what he was calling a rebellion. He didn't want to call it a war. Because he thought that would legitimize the South. He had no idea he was going to need a lot more than 75,000 men. But my point is that this is the line that was crossed that started the Civil War. Now this brings us to the third myth about the Civil War. Right from the start, this is more of a Northern myth. Right from the start, the Civil War was a crusade against slavery, and most Northern men signed up to fight against slavery. This is just not true. The men who signed up were fighting against treason. They were fighting against the rebellion of traitors. Men who had turned against the United States of America, had fired on the American flag. That's treason. And that's what these men, by and large, that's what these tens of thousands of volunteers signed up for. And Lincoln himself, in his earliest meetings with his cabinet, and in statements to the press, he wrote a letter to Horace Greeley, and he made it clear that he had no intention of abolishing slavery. That was not his aim. He said, I have taken a sacred oath to preserve the Union, and that's what I'm going to do. I did not take a sacred oath to abolish slavery. He said, if I had, I'd do it, but that's not what the oath reads. It reads, preserve, protect, and defend the United States of America. And he said, that's what I'm obligated to do, and that's what I'm going to do. And if I can do it without touching slavery, I will do it without touching slavery. And he made that very clear. But then, by 1862, it was clear the war was going to be long and bloody. The death tolls were climbing very steadily. And Lincoln was hoping that Southern leaders would come back to their senses, that they would say, look, this is going on too far. Too many of our children, too many of your children are being killed. Let's negotiate. Let's work something out. Lincoln would have been amenable to that at that point. But no such overture was ever made. Instead, the opposite happened. Southern leaders in state after state had these mass rallies in which they said, we will fight this war to the end. We don't care if 1 million people are killed. We will never stop. This is an all or nothing war. Well, Lincoln was hearing this in 1862, and he said, basically, Okay, I got the message. It's going to be all or nothing. In that case, since you opened the door to this, what I want, my all or nothing, is slavery. I'm going to, if you're going to force us to fight an all-out war, then why not fight to abolish slavery? And this is what causes him to reason this out in this way. It's the Southern intransigence, the absolute unwillingness to come to any sort of negotiating position on these issues. Then, in September 17th, 1862, the deadliest single day in all of U.S. history, the Battle of Antietam in Antietam Creek in Maryland. Over 4,000 Americans are killed, more than at Pearl Harbor, more than at D-Day, more than at the Twin Towers on 9/11. A horrific day, but it is a Union victory. The Union turns back a Confederate invasion. So Lincoln chooses that moment to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This is one of the most misunderstood documents in U.S. history. And it brings us to the myth number 4. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was a powerless declaration that didn't make any practical difference in the war. Well, if you just look at the statements in the proclamation at face value, it can certainly seem that way. Here's the key statement. On January 1st, 1863, he issued the proclamation in September, but it wouldn't become effective until January 1st of the following year. He was hoping to persuade some of the southern states to come back and negotiate, but they didn't do that. But anyway, on January 1st, 1863, all persons held as slaves in places still in rebellion against the United States of America shall be forever free. Now, people look at this and they say, wow, big deal, huh? He's going to free all the slaves who aren't free. He's saying you're now free, even though they are patently not free. And meanwhile, slaves in the border states, they're going to remain slaves. The slaves he can free, he doesn't free. The slaves he cannot free, he frees them. So people laugh at this. They say this is pathetic. This is just a pathetic political ploy. It means nothing. It has no practical purpose. Well, if you think about it for a minute, if you kind of go beyond the surface and you look at the meaning of the document, you realize what the proclamation means is that every time U.S. forces carrying that flag push into southern areas, and every time they encounter slaves, those slaves will immediately be set free. A lot of literate, well-educated people don't understand that. But you know who did understand it? The slaves. They may have been illiterate, they may have not gotten a proper education, but the slaves understood. Just by word of mouth, carried from one person to another. The slaves understood. If you're in the field and you look up and you see the U.S. flag off in the distance, a mile away, drop your tools and start running for that flag. Because if you can reach it, you will be free. The slaves understood that. They freed themselves by the tens of thousands, because they saw that flag in the distance and they knew what it meant. So this argument that it was powerless and pointless is absurd. It's made by people who can't see beyond the surface and see the real meaning behind words. In that one stroke of a pen, Lincoln made this a moral war. He made it a war with a supremely moral purpose, to crush slavery once and for all in America. And that made a huge difference for the slaves, it made all the difference in the world. And nothing says it better than the fact that over 200,000 black men enlisted to serve in the U.S. Army or the U.S. Navy. 130,000 of them were slaves. You have to understand this. These guys had just been liberated, and they turned around and said, where do I sign up? I want to be a warrior in the cause against slavery. 26 of those men got the Medal of Honor. The fifth myth about the Civil War: the South lost the war only because the North had far more men, materiel, and money. This is the essence of the lost cause mythology. You see it written about in a number of books, and it has many different facets. The whole lost cause ideology has many different moving parts. But the core of it, the real guts of it, is that Southern society was superior to Northern society. It had a superior spirit. Its people were just better people. They were more noble. Their ideals were higher. This is the essence of the lost cause. The South didn't win the war only because the North had an advantage in those crude items like money, like industrial resources, like raw manpower, just sheer quantity of numbers. That's the only reason why the North won. And the South could never have prevailed against that kind of disadvantage. This is the lost cause. This is the center of the lost cause thinking. Well, the North did have more men. The North did have almost three times more men than the South. That's true. Was it a factor? Yes, it was. The North did have 9 times the industrial capacity of the South. Was that a factor in the outcome of the war? Yes, it was. The North did manage its economy better than the South. We talked about this in our last get-together. Did that have an effect on the outcome of the Civil War? Yes, it certainly did. But the South could very well have won the war. This was quite within the realm of possibility. And geography tells us the story. This is Lloyd's map of the South. Now, he includes Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware in the South. Those states, the border states, did not secede. They should not be included in the true Confederate South. The Confederate South consisted of over 780,000 square miles of land. That's bigger than Great Britain and Germany and France and Italy combined. I think you can also throw Spain in. That's one heck of a chunk of real estate. Now, the South, to win the war, the South did not have to conquer 1 square inch of northern land. All they had to do was keep the North from conquering huge swaths, strategic chunks of the South. If they could do that, they would eventually win the war. How did we defeat Great Britain? We made them keep fighting, until they got sick of it and said, this isn't worth it. Let's go home. How did we lose in Vietnam? The war kept dragging on and on and on. All those terrible flag-draped coffins coming home. More and more Americans said, what the heck is going on? Why are we doing this? There's no end in sight. Let's cut our losses and run. The South could easily have inflicted that kind of loss, not easily, but it was well within the realm of possibility that the South could have inflicted that on the North. Make the war interminable, make it unwinnable, make it go on and on and on until Northerners said, this just isn't worth it. They want to form their own country? Let them form their own country. Let them go. Why are we slaughtering hundreds of thousands of our own children, trying to keep them with us? This almost happened in 1864, the third year of the war. Lincoln was coming up for re-election. The war was going very badly for the North. It was a stalemate at that point. In the spring, summer of 1864, every day, men were being killed. And Northerners couldn't see why this was happening anymore. The crucial strategic southern cities, Richmond, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, especially Atlanta, Georgia, one of the last remaining industrial hubs of the Confederacy, were all in Southern hands. And people felt like these places are never going to fall and the war is never going to end. So more and more Northerners were turning against the war just before the election of 1864. Now, the Democrats put forth a peace platform. They said we should negotiate with the South and bring the war to a negotiated end. Now, George McClellan was the candidate, ex-Confederate general, ex-Union general, was candidate for the Democrat Party. It isn't clear that he wasn't going to continue fighting the war. He indicated that he was going to continue fighting the war. However, he also indicated that if the South wanted to negotiate a peace on the basis of the South being allowed to keep its slaves, that he was open to that. That was negotiable for him. He was amenable to that. So more and more people were turning to McClellan and the Democrats. Lincoln himself believed he was going to lose. In the summer of 1864, he believed he was going to lose the upcoming election. He told his wife, he told the members of his cabinet, every indication is that I'm going to lose. Because America is sick, the Northerners are sick of the war. Because it was a stalemate at that point. And then something happened. In the middle of the war map, in northern Georgia, a duel, kind of a military duel, was being carried out between these two really excellent generals, William Tecumseh Sherman for the North and Joseph Eggleston Johnston for the South. Tecumseh had a much bigger army, much better equipped. But Johnson was fighting on the defensive, which gave him an advantage, and he was a very good defensive general. Wasn't good at attacking, but he was great at defending. So they engaged in this really kind of high-stakes chess match. Sherman is pushing down from Tennessee, he's pushing through northern Georgia. What he wants is right there. That's his prize, Atlanta. He wants to crush Atlanta, bring it into the Union fold before the election of 1864. He wants to give Atlanta as a gift to Abraham Lincoln before the election so that it might sway Northern voters in Lincoln's favor. But Johnston is making it almost impossible. Every time Sherman moves his army south, Johnston blocks him. Sherman tries to go around him, and Johnston re-maneuvers his army and blocks him. And then Sherman tries to go the other way, and the same thing happens. Johnston is very good at quickly reforming his army and creating defensive lines in other parts of the battlefield. This is his genius as a battlefield commander. And he's really giving Sherman fits. The one time Sherman says, the hell with it, I'm just going to throw my army at him and give him a knockout punch. Well, they run right into a solidly entrenched Southern line, and the Southerners inflict a massive defeat on Sherman's armies.
Where was that?
So, at Kennesaw Mountain. They were the first battle of Kennesaw Mountain. And Sherman learns his lesson. We can't do this again. We're not going to do another frontal assault. So he goes back to his old strategy, somehow trying to get around Johnston's flanks. This becomes his strategy. But it's very time consuming. And that's what Johnston is counting on. He's counting on Atlanta still being in Southern hands when the Northerners hold their election in November 1864. Well, another factor comes into this drama. This guy, Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, he doesn't like what Johnston's doing. He says, you're fighting purely defensively, he tells Johnston. He complains to Johnston, calls him to his office and argues with him. Johnston tells him, Mr. President, I have less than half as many men as Sherman. He's got better guns, he's got better cannons. The best I can do is keep trying to fend him off. If I attack him, he's going to decimate my army. And then there'll be nothing left to stop him from moving into Atlanta. Davis says, poppycock. If you're a true Southern commander, you'll get out there and you'll lick him. You'll show him what for. And he fires Johnston. And who does he bring in? John Bell Hood, fiery Texan. Had his leg blown off, I think at Gettysburg. But now he's healed, and they strap him on a horse to get him into action. Still very active, wants to fight. Very brave man, very, very brave. No questioning this guy's bravery. Incredibly stupid man. When it comes to tactics, and his own soldiers would be the first to say it. This guy, you could find a squirrel somewhere that would come up with better battlefield tactics than John Bell Hood. Well, Davis puts him in charge and says, go get him, John Bell, go get him, teach him what Southern manhood is all about. So John Bell gathers his army and says, attack. There's no feint, there's no this, there's no that. It's just, there they are, get up and rush at them. Well, Sherman can't believe it. Sherman and his officers are looking, and can this be happening, And they absolutely decimate the Southerners. They just mow them down. Well, enough Southerners retreat, they lick their wounds, and John Bell Hood looks at them and says, well, that was tough. But you know what? One more try and they'll break. So he orders them, get up and attack. And they do. And again, Sherman can't believe it. And again, they absolutely slaughter these poor guys. I'm sorry?
Where were those battles?
One was at Peachtree Creek, and I forget the names of the other two areas, but they were small meadows and areas north of Atlanta. And once again, the survivors limp back, they're bleeding, they're broken, and John Bell Hood looks at them and says, wow, that was brave, But you know what, he says. He says, if we give it one more try, this will work this time. We've got them. We've got them on the rope. So he orders a third attack. And once again, they're just slaughtered. And by the end of it, his army is in tatters. He doesn't have enough men to defend Atlanta. Exactly what Johnston predicted to Jefferson Davis. You're not going to have enough of an army to keep Atlanta safe. And that's what happens. The army has to withdraw, and William Tecumseh Sherman literally just walks into, he doesn't have to fight his way in, he just walks in. He trots in on horseback and all his soldiers. This is a very accurate portrait. All of his soldiers are walking in next to him. They're not rushing, they're not ducking. There's nothing there to stop them anymore. So newspapers all over the country, including the South, realized what this meant. This news got to the North over a month before Election Day. So people had time to really digest it. And they understood if Atlanta fell, that means this war is winnable. They crushed the industrial heart of the South. That means we really can see the light at the end of the tunnel. This certainly swayed a lot of voters in Lincoln's favor. And he ended up winning the election by a very decisive majority. And what gratified Lincoln the most, he got 75% of the soldiers' vote. The Army and the Navy was all for Lincoln. They wanted to keep fighting this war until slavery was crushed. So the idea that it was just about money, material, manpower, simply not true. Those were certainly factors, but they were not the deciding factors. The real deciding factor is the North had better leaders, military leaders, and especially this guy. When you read about what Lincoln had to deal with during the Civil War on every front, the political front, the economic front, the military front, even his own home family front. He lost his son. His son died of typhoid, I think. His son, Willie, who he loved, died of typhoid in the middle of the war. His wife was almost losing her mind. I mean that seriously. She was struggling with her sanity. He was getting letters from bereaved families. Can you find my children? Can you find my sons? And one day in his cabinet, he looked at his cabinet and he said, if there's a place worse than hell, I am in it. But Lincoln shouldered the burden for America. He carried on. And he waged the war he brought the war to a successful conclusion. It was about leadership. And that's something the Southerners just couldn't admit. That the North had better, wiser, more intelligent leaders than the South did. And on that note, today's talk comes to an end. We're almost up against it, but we have time for questions and comments, observations. Yes, sir.
Approximately how many slaves did the South have?
Around close to 4 million. Yeah, it was a pretty big chunk of Southern society. That's why whites in the South were terrified at the prospect of a slave uprising because there were so many of them. In some states, they almost outnumbered the whites. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, when you get right down to it, outside of politics and the battles, slavery really means free labor. That's what it's all about. You said last week, there are many countries all over this planet that still go for slavery. Still talking about free labor. If you can have, just imagine if you're running a business in America or anywhere, and you've got free labor, then everything you make from the selling of your product is 100% profit. I don't think it had anything to do with skin color, to be honest.
It didn't in Greece and Rome.
Today, in various parts of this planet are white, yellow, whatever.
That's true.
Nothing to do with skin color.
That's true.
To do with money. When you sell the cotton to Great Britain or to the North, or all of the places up here that made cotton, made it into material.
Right. That's a very valid point. One thing I would add to it is that, yes, it enriches the slave owner, but it ultimately retards the society. That's why the Southern economy was so backwards, because slavery kind of crippled the Southern economy. The Northern economy was able to function much more effectively because it was based on a free labor principle that workers, they labored and they were paid for their time and efforts. And that creates a healthier economy for a society.
Well, I mean, the whole concept of it is bad. We know that.
Yes, absolutely, no question.
The idea of free labor is what is behind the whole thing.
Yeah, just gross selfishness.
All of the South was agrarian, growing things from the ground. The North was industrialized,
That's right.
and that came.
Although we had a lot of farms too.
Yeah, well, I mean,
We were actually out producing the South in agriculture too, even though the South was exclusively an agricultural society. And our agriculture was more varied. We had all kinds of foods, fruits, vegetables, grains. The South focused on tobacco, rice, and cotton, whereas we had a much wider variety of things. So on every count, the Northern economy worked better because it wasn't based on slavery. Yes, sir.
Great presentation. I have two questions. First, I understood you to say that the number of deaths for the North was greater than the South, which I always thought was the other way around. I thought they lost more people. My second question is, do you think it's true that another effect of the Emancipation Proclamation that it had an influence on European thinking rather than
Oh, it absolutely did.
Britain would come in? I mean, is that really a possibility that Britain would come in on the side of the Confederacy?
I don't know that Britain would have come in on the side of the Confederacy. I don't think so, and not in any military sense. But what they would have done, number one, they would have recognized the sovereignty of the South, which would have given the South a tremendous boost, and it would have made it more likely that other nations would then have come forward and recognize the sovereignty of the South. Secondly, the British traders and other commercial vessels from other countries would have made it more likely that they would have tried to break the Union blockade and deliver supplies into southern ports. So both of those things would have really hurt the North if that had happened. The Emancipation Proclamation took Europe right out of the war. Absolutely. But for a moral reason. People cynically say, oh, Lincoln did it it was just a military tactic. No, he knew the Europeans had already come to the understanding that slavery was just wrong, it was just evil. And he felt that way himself. So it was very much a moral decision too. I mean, it certainly had a military application.
And it's true that the North lost more men than the South.
Yes, because the North had to crush the South. The South could fight. You lose fewer men when you're fighting defensively. The battles when the South lost more men than the North was when they were attacking the North. Gettysburg, Antietam, when they were going at the North. But when you're defending, especially in the Civil War, with the kind of military technology that they had then, you inflict a lot more casualties when you're defending than when you're attacking. So, and the North had to keep attacking the South for 4 years, and that's why they lost so many men. But the South did lose staggering numbers as well. Yes, sir.
My daughter lives in Manchester, England, and I remember visiting her for the first time. She's been there for many, many years. And we go downtown, and there's a large statue of Abraham Lincoln. And I'm thinking, what the hell do they have a statue of Abraham Lincoln in Milltown in England, okay? Well, the history of it is just what we're talking about. The mill owners wanted the South to win, and they were supporting, wanted to break the blockade, get the cotton from the South, and really do wonders with whatever they would get. But the workers, now we're talking about paid workers now, not slaves, okay? They would not work on Southern cotton.
Wow.
They shut the mills down and all kinds of things, and they eventually built a statue of Lincoln sitting with and the commemoration had all that information.
How's that for a moral stand, huh? William Wilberforce, the whole battle against slavery in England. I'm thinking late 1700s, and they imposed it on their colonies that they wouldn't allow slaves to be shipped to their colonies anymore. It was kind of a gradual process. I'm thinking late 1700s, but I would need to double check that. And when America gained its independence from Great Britain, they ended the slave trade. I think they slated it for 1808. They said as of 1808, no more new slaves will be allowed into the United States. So to some extent, they were trying to follow England's lead, but they weren't doing a very good job of it.
But a lot of the Caribbean countries had slavery up until 1830.
Oh, absolutely.
1840.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. But after we, I think Brazil had it years, decades after us. And then the Islamic countries had it into the 20th century. I think Mauritania, was 2002 or something. They said, we'll do away with slavery.
China still has it.
Yeah. Several countries still have virtual forms of slavery. Yes, sir.
To put that number, that statistic, 700 and plus thousand dead in the Civil War. We were a nation of, at the time, 40 million people then?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay, today we're a nation of 330. That's a factor of what, 8 or 9?
Something like that.
Multiply 8 or 9 by 700,000,
Yeah,
and you get an idea of what those losses meant.
that's an excellent point. Yeah, everyone was more than touched by the tragedies of the Civil War. Everyone took lost
I don't
us.
think the nation today would put up with that.
Yeah. Oh, you're absolutely. We could never go through that again. Never. Let's hope we never do. Yes, sir.
I'd like to your opinion on the concept of in the South, maybe 1 out of every 50 or 1 out of every 100 owned slaves, and yet the non-slave owners came strongly beyond, at that phase, beyond the states' rights, say, that shifted more into the slavery issue. Why did they so vigorously support, effectively, the wealth factor by the poor Southern people who actually were competing with a lot of the slavery labor? Why were they willing to die to preserve the South beyond states' rights and preserve the slave issue?
Yes. Excellent question. We could discuss that for about 2 hours. But I'll give you my version of the short and dirty. The slave owners in the South, the planters, the elite class that really ruled Southern society, created a society that taught its young that slavery was normal and it was acceptable, that it was good for black people. Ultimately, we're doing them a favor, and it improves society. It's good for everyone, and they taught this in their schools. They taught this at home. Believe it or not, they taught this in churches. They somehow, that whole line about treating others as you would want them to treat you, somehow they managed to just completely get rid of that line. I don't know how they managed that. But, and anyone who disagreed in Southern society was chased out of town on a rail. There were Southerners who said slavery's wrong. There were some people who were capable of thinking for themselves to that extent, that they realized whatever they're telling us, this is wrong. But they were literally chased out of town. They were literally told to leave, or they were beaten into silence. In one town, I'm not sure if it was Atlanta, but 13 newspaper writers were forced to leave, were threatened with their lives because they were writing articles that would say, like this slave family had been broken up and sent to all different parts. Mothers separated from children, brothers from sisters. This is wrong. Well, that writer disappeared. And this would happen again and again and again. So that cultural elite created a society that taught people to think of slavery as part of their culture, part of their heritage. This is something that makes you you. And by the way, no matter how down and dirty you are as a farmer, you may think of yourself as an 80-acre farmer, but guess what? There's someone lower than you. So all of this appealed to the Southern mentality. And that's why they were so vehemently in favor of slavery. Some of the reasons, anyway. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yes. My wife and I, we had some old college friends of hers from Mississippi. And we were barbecue, we were sitting out in the yard, this is several years ago, and I was referring to the Civil War. And they kept looking at me like, you know, like I was talking Greek, you know. And then one of them said, "Oh, you're talking about the War of Northern Aggression." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, it's amazing the way that they've been indoctrinated to see that war. It's incredible." And these were college-educated people. Yeah, very telling.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. One more question.
One more question. You may not be able to answer this. It's another kind of, why would this have happened? I know that image of the slaves running to the flag and being rescued in that way is wonderful. Grant had but why, if there were 4 million slaves in the South, why could they keep them down for so long during this war? Even though they must have had all their men going off to battle. I mean, it just seems like the institution, which was based on brutality,
Yeah,
how could it be maintained for those 4 years?
you kind of answered your question. Sheer brutality, the sheer fear of horrific punishment. After the last big slave uprising, I forget his name, the slave. No, the one before that. It was led by black slaves. Nate Turner, thank you. After the punishments that were inflicted on anyone who had anything to do with that were, you know, close to crucifixion. I mean, it was absolutely diabolical. And slaves learned, you toe the line. Otherwise, you know, they go after you, they go after your loved ones. And they will make you pay in just pure pain. That's a powerful lesson. It's hard not to be cowed by that lesson. Like the Nazis, yeah. Pain is a horrifyingly effective teacher. So, anyway, thank you all for being here today.